literally no time to prepare for this speech. Is going to be a pretty scuffed PM. One, when do these elections tend to be called? Because I think the vast majority of snap elections do tend to be called in the developing world, and there are multiple reasons why this is true. This is the place where there's likely to be very little correcting mechanism on this, and I think this is empirically true. So in places like Pakistan and in Thailand, you had elections over the last decade, which have existed empirically. And I think when the UK tried to implement this, they failed massively as well, which means that in 27, so based on empirical evidence, it's more likely it's going to be done within the developing world because it's a place where people tend to be less educated and therefore have lower correcting mechanisms on this. I'm going to run two arguments in PM. One, why does it worsen discourse surrounding the election? Two, why does it create a stronghold on the majoritarian party? And why does this harm overall outcomes? So one, why does it actually worsen the discourse surrounding the election? There are broadly multiple reasons why this is true. Number one, political parties and candidates obviously have very limited time to communicate their platforms effectively. You're unable to do things like communicate your policy. You're unable to do things like communicate what actually matters. This is especially important when you're a minority party within these countries, because the majority already have some level of time at the point which they know when they're going to end up actually pushing this forward. Therefore, the ability for them to prepare compared to other people means it's an asymmetric capacity for preparation. But second, the media also has less time to do things like provide in-depth analysis and investigate these kinds of policies, investigate claims that people make, which means there's more sensationalist coverage, which focuses on things like personalities, scandals, and strongmen, as opposed to actually focusing on the things that matter, because investigative journalism has never gone that far. But third, in a compressed election timeframe, there's also less time to fact-check these claims. There's less time to debunk misinformation. So politicians are able to get away with saying things which aren't empirically true or require more time to actually research, which means that there's a environment which spreads false information and spreads propaganda, as opposed to you actually being able to focus on things that genuinely matter. But fourth, voters themselves are less informed about the candidates and their policies, because the vast majority of voting preferences aren't evaluated based upon the election timeframe themselves, but rather evaluated over the last 4 years or over the last 5 years. And when voters aren't able to know that there's an election coming up, they're unlikely to know what they should be voting for and what actually matters. Therefore, the voters themselves tend to be uninformed. But also, I think there's heightened polarization during this time period as well, because lots of campaigns tend to focus on things like fear-mongering, divisive rhetoric, and this is empirically true when you want quick mobilized support. So you're going to focus on more toxic and hostile sentiments in order to guarantee that certain people are going to come out and vote. Given that people already don't expect this to be election season, voter turnouts are going to be low symmetrically on both sides. But second, when candidates themselves prioritize the short-term things, they're likely to prioritize populist issues which garner quick support, as opposed to like addressing the long-term challenges which are more important as well. Which means you have smaller, shallower discourse which focuses on things like immediate gains. This is going to be quite crucial when I point out the instances when parties actually end up utilizing this. So why does it increase the stronghold on the majoritarian party? Note that in the vast majority of cases, snap elections are called by majoritarian parties when they believe there's an advantage that they can have within the political landscape. So they're often done after a specific policy decision is made, after a specific economic upturn, which means that the ruling party knows that general sentiment is already good for them. So they often skew the election results in their favor. This is quite critical analysis, because at the point in which the party knows they're able to win, at the point in which they hold this, they're going to utilize it in order to try and get to this point as well. And there's important analysis as to why this is important, and there's important reasons as to why this argument is debate winning. Because if it is true that there's an asymmetric amount of power granted to the majority party at the point where they're the ones who are able to call on this election, they're the ones who are also able to exploit the public sentiment and exploit what's already considered naturally accepted within society. This is quite important because, as evidence between things like Argentina in the 1980s, when public sentiment itself shifts towards things like certain nationalist rhetoric, nationalist parties which tend to be in power are able to, one, exploit the fact that they're more nationalist, or exploit the fact that they're more pro-military, and therefore they're able to capitalize on the security threats and the natural disasters which exist, and therefore they're able to ride the surge in nationalist and supportive sentiments, which then undermines the overall democratic process. Because all of these preferences are things that people have momentarily, but not preferences that they're likely to maintain in the long run, which means the political system becomes a lot worse and the majoritarian party is able to control this more. Why is this extremely harmful because when the majoritarian party ends up winning again, or when they end up winning on a landslide, they control more seats in parliament. They control more they control more seats in things like in more seats in things like Congress, which means the capacity for them to be able to elect and elect policies also shifts over the next 4 years. So there's less capacity for other parties to be able to counteract this because of the fact that the majoritarian party holds more control. I'll take the point from closing.
Yeah, so why is it that snap elections are comparatively rare throughout the world if it is true that you can just constantly call these and then infinitely stay in power?
I don't know. I just think it's empirically true. Maybe you guys can come up with a cool argument. I know you guys want me to give you the response which you're going to weaponize. I'm not going to do that. Okay, let's first analyze why this is important in weighing against every other team in the debate, and no matter what they control, or no matter what analysis they give. So the reason for why snap elections themselves are harmful is because they, one, undermine the capacity for a democratic system to operate within democratic principles. So what are democratic principles? We think people's ability to make informed choices based upon what actually matters to them means that people are able to make choices that they're able to project into the long term. On their side of the house, they cannot do this. And the reason for why they cannot do this is because they themselves tend to be uninformed critically about what's quite important within these countries. And therefore, they don't know what they're going to be voting for. But also, the amount of people who turn out to vote is also low, which means that the ability for certain minorities who might have other things planned on these days or planned on this week means that they are unable to, one, consume information in the best meaningful manners, and therefore their politically informed decisions don't matter, but also they themselves don't go out to vote, and therefore the overall number of people and voter turnout also doesn't exist. And this is the most important analysis in the debate, because in any democratic system, we think that the people on the ground are the ones that matter. So this obviously harms people on the ground, because you don't, in order for you to be able to have a functioning democracy, you also need voter turnout. In my second speech, I'll impact why I think funding becomes a lot worse as well, and why I think parties don't generally care about them, but it's still a lot worse for people. So at the end of the speech, I've proven, one, why you're able to have worsened discourse surrounding the election, but two, why it actually increases the stronghold of the majoritarian party, and therefore the ability for them to be able to pass policies that don't cater to everyone's interests. For all those reasons, very proud to win an opening government.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We'd like to invite the LO.
Okay, I actually just decided I should do the thing where I say nice things about Rose. Very nice debating with you, Rose. You've done very good this tournament. It's lovely. Yeah, good times. I don't know what else to say. I don't know. We're autism creatures after all. Couple of points of framing, and then we're going to run a relatively clear case with three big thrusts. The first on why this allows governments to retain the incumbency or to stress advantages which they likely have during a sort of cycle. This is actually a good thing. Secondly, why there are unique cases where the government mandate may have changed due to reasons exogenous to the previous election and might be necessary to just figure out where a country stands. And thirdly, why the threat of snap elections keeps opposition parties honest and prevents them from resting on their laurels. First, let's respond to opening government a little bit. I think it's not as if snap elections happen in 1 week, and they certainly happen a lot outside of the developing world, something they simply say is empirically true. For instance, France just saw a snap election called a couple weeks ago. You'd think the team from London would know this and didn't have to have a North American team explain this to them. But these things are quite common in a lot of European states. Let's respond to the rest of opening government's case. They say that there's a preparation asymmetry. The first thing is, if you've called the election, this is not true. The other parties know that the election is happening 6 months from now, and they prepare just like they normally would in any other kind of election cycle. But if, like, the government's behind the scenes and through closed doors preparing a bunch of election material or preparing for their election, it's not very clear how they could accomplish this without this leaking out. I don't think that parties can just keep this kind of information behind. And, if you're doing it with such a small number of people, that this preparation asymmetry could avoid being leaking, it's not going to be very meaningful, because you just have like 50 members of like the party elites making decisions. It's not like a huge competitive advantage for that party. And also, I think a lot of parties tend to get a sense that a snap election might come because, for instance, the minority party is polling unusually high, and they go, perhaps they're going to stress this advantage, try and push their minority into a majority, like this is realistically what they would do. So you probably have an inkling as an opposition party that there's a reason they might want to call a snap election. Is there interference? Let's be clear about what opening government's claim is here. They're saying that you're going to manipulate the electoral system by calling a free and fair election very quickly. This is the strangest and most bizarre way country could possibly see someone trying to subvert democratic norms. Surely you would just subvert the democratic norms by any other way. Let's explain why I think governments retaining incumbency is good. I think there's two broad ways in which governments use snap elections to do this. The first is that there might be for opening government's own analysis here, using it against them, there are often short blurbs, maybe there has been a specific scandal with one of the key opposition parties that makes them uniquely weak. Perhaps there has been a policy that has just recently passed that makes you look good. Perhaps the economy is going gangbusters this year. And so you just feel we can probably win if we call in an election now. Or perhaps you have a minority election and you want to pull in and sort of push your advantage because you think you've done a relatively good job. I don't understand why this is a problem and why governments, if people want to vote for them, shouldn't be allowed to call the election a little early and have people vote for them then, right? There's nothing funny or illegitimate about this. The people are still choosing to vote for this government at the time and place in which they're doing it. And it's actually quite good to have this level of cohesion and to not flip-flop parties consistently, right? Because you don't have the inherent inefficiencies of transfer where people have to shift over and now start pursuing other policies that might be in direct opposition to what the government in power was trying to achieve. They can undergo larger time frame scale projects that might take 6 years, so they can call the snap election a little early ahead of the 4-year window and actually have the full 6 years to implement and push that 6-year project through power. And as well, I think financial investors and allies of the state probably appreciate the consistency and the chronology of people who are fulfilling key positions like whether or not they're going to fulfill their NATO commitments, whether or not they're going to continue funding Ukraine, like all of these kinds of things that people like to see consistency in the behavior of governments from. All of this means that governments retain a certain level of control that we think we've given you some plausible impacting is a very, very good thing. Before I get into contexts in which it's important to have a snap election, I'll take something from closing. Okay, never mind. Let's get into unique contexts. So I think there's instances, thinking here about wars, about COVID, about massive groundbreaking scandals, where it is just necessary for people to have an election. I'm pretty sure Britain actually did this when they had the Brexit vote. They called a snap election and it sort of became like the Brexit election. They were like, let's all have like a national conversation. Let's figure out what we're going to do. This is a good thing, right? There are contexts in which somebody voted for a party, but circumstances happened that nobody could have predicted, like a massive virus or a war. And all of a sudden, now the context and the things facing the country and the things voters might care about are very different than they used to be. So it's reasonable for the government to go, hey, let's make sure you guys are all still on our side. Let's make sure everybody's still on board. Like, I think a lot of the time government might respond to this claim by just being like, parties would never do this if it's altruistic because everyone's evil. This is such a pessimistic, kind of silly and boring view of politics. I think a lot of people who work in politics do so, giving up other avenues where they could earn more money elsewhere because they genuinely care. So I think the idea that a government wouldn't, in some instances, perhaps small, but certainly quite important, where it's critical to ensure that the people who are making important decisions on behalf of the nation are people that have the stamp of approval from their electorate, I really think they would do this in some contexts, and this is important. Thirdly, I think the threat of a snap election keeps opposition parties honest. It's quite easy for opposition parties to rest on their laurel, like the official opposition, what we're supposed to be in this sort of play parliament, don't have to do their job if they know that the election's not for another 4 years. Right? It's easy to just not do anything and chill and collect your pension or whatever, right? But when the party could call a snap election, you have to consistently criticize what the government's doing, hold them accountable, actually fulfill their job, and maintain some level of cohesion as a party that people understand what they stand for and what they do. This means that voters, ironically, opposed to what opening government is saying, actually have a stronger picture on who they would be voting for if this opposition party were held into power, because they know a snap election could come at any point, and they behave expecting that to be a possibility. This means any government that wins is more electable because people have a better picture on who stands for what. Whole system works better. Vote opening off.
We thank the speaker for the speech. We'd like to invite the PPM.
Yeah, can I be heard?
Yeah.
All right. A lot of the opposition mitigation on our case relies upon the premise that there is a lot of time between when the snap election is announced and when the election actually occurs. They say 6 months. This is absolute BS. In the UK, it happened it happened within a month when it was in 2017. In India, in the 1990s, it happened somewhere around like 6 weeks, which means there's already incentives to ensure that it happens within a short time frame. All of this means that a lot of the trust that we get from government on op bench doesn't actually work, because the amount of time that parties have to prepare for this isn't as big as they claim, and the amount of time that journalists have to accurately convey and like have investigative journalism on this also doesn't work. All of this means that people are likely to make rash choices based upon public sentiment at that point in time. I'll point out why this is why this is bad, directly contesting that claim in a bit, but I'm going to first explore the psyche of voters when something big happens. Because when certain things happen, like immediate economic upturn or immediate rise in national sentiment because of things like certain policies or certain global events, it means that individual voters themselves tend to be short-sighted based upon that one single thing. So you vote based upon the public sentiment at that point in time, which is the greatest and most important. But the problem is that what happens right now isn't accurate to what happens later on as well. So maybe it is true that you should vote for a party that is pro-militarization at the point at which something happens around the world. But when this is unlikely to happen towards in your country, and you have to consider the fact that this is something that this party is going to have control over for the next 4 years, it means that the amount of general broad policy that the party is able to implement is also a lot worse. What does this look like? It looks like you implementing parties which are very bad at their economic policy or very bad at their international policy. But what actually you focus on is the progress that they've already done in that short period of time. But I also want to flag why this is quite crucial in how it affects minority parties and opposition parties themselves, because they say the opposition parties are forced to be on their tiptoe. But this is precisely the problem. When opposition parties cannot freely implement policy because they know at the point at which they screw up, the majority party is likely to call a snap election and exploit the advantage that they have, they're unlikely to pursue any form of meaningful change on their own behalf. This means that they're unlikely to try and implement new policy or implement meaningful policy, because they know that at the point at which they do this, their advantage in parliament is likely to be significantly smaller. And this is quite crucial because the majority party is not beholden to the same burden. They can do whatever they want, and they know if it screws over, they still have another 2 or 3 years to recuperate and cover up, but the other parties do not, and therefore their capacity to be able to exercise their autonomy is also limited. And this is quite important because if the party is unable to perform certain things as per their own framework, it means that the party themselves are unlikely to be able to get broad general support. The opposition party in the vast majority of cases needs to perform something like rash or something important in order for them to be able to gain seats in parliament. They're unlikely to be able to do this on their side of the house when they're forced to be complacent and they're forced to just listen in order for them to be able to maintain the small percentage of seats that they have in parliament. This is critical. But second, I want to point out why this harms funding necessarily within why this harms the ability of these parties to actually function. And there are broadly 3 reasons why this is true. Number one, it's genuinely hard to campaign when you only have 3 or 4 weeks to set up your campaigning, set up the funding, set up the amount of time you're going to end up spending on certain things and on covering certain ideas, which means the ability of the party to be able to focus on these things itself is very small. And this is critical because when the party is unable to convey the general sentiment of their claim, when they're unable to convey what it is they actually support and people are unable to consume this information properly and the kinds of policies that these parties support, then people vote on the rashness as well. But there's also an asymmetric distribution of this knowledge as well. So certain parties have so the majority party has the capacity to know when they're going to hold this new election, but the other party does not. So they are likely to have more than 4 weeks to prepare, maybe 6, maybe 8, I don't know. But the problem is certain people within the party are likely to know this a bit earlier, and therefore the ability for these people to actively support and identify what ideology and what policy they support is a lot easier, which means parties themselves have an advantage and the snap election is bad. So why does this harm the economic state of the country? And I'm going to talk about why I think this is harmful for investment as well. And the reason for why this is quite harmful for investment is because people themselves know that a lot of investment which occurs within countries occurs on the premise that the amount of control that party or a specific policy has within parliament is contingent and is going to remain the same for the next 4 years, which means when the majority party is likely to continuously exploit any advantage that they have in order to continuously keep on growing their influence, the ability of investors to invest in the country is often very low. And this is quite important because the majority party tends not to support claims and tends not to support things that are genuinely important for the vast majority of people in these areas. So in many post-colonial states, the majority party tends to exploit sentiment and exploit rhetoric, which means the party themselves tend not to cater towards these people's interests outside of them exploiting these sentiments. So at the point at which you force investment to occur within these areas, you force the people to the kinds of people who are likely to invest within the third world are going to be people who already support the majoritarian ideology as opposed to the other forms, which means the ability for liberal institutions to operate within third world decreases because the majority party is likely to oust you if they're able to gain more seats in parliament, and they have the capacity to gain more seats in parliament within like the second or third year if they call a snap election. Whereas if they're forced to the amount of seats in parliament remains symmetric and constant for the next 4 years, your ability to be able to make long-term investments also increases. And therefore, the ability for third world countries, especially to come into the ability for third world countries themselves to maintain investment is a lot better. Why is all of this important? Because we think that in any political system, the ability to make informed choices is the delta on whether or not democracy stands. And we think informed choices comes in a number of ways. The first is you have to have access to information. You have to know what the party is supporting. You need to know the general policy stances in certain things. And people are unlikely to search up on this information at the point which you have a snap election. But second, parties and candidates themselves have less time on their side to develop and communicate what it is they support because of the fact that you need funding in order for you to be able to campaign. You need funding in order for you to be able to access these kinds of things. And you're unable to do this when you have a limited time frame to, one, collect the funding, 2, allocate the funding, 3, organize the funding. And this means that people are unlikely to, and smaller parties themselves are unlikely to be able to critically operate within these regions, and therefore they themselves are screwed, whereas the majority are able to maintain control. All of this means that this is a clear opening government.
Also, we thank the speaker for their speech. We'd like to invite the DLO to close the talk off.
Cool. I guess thanks for pro-amming me, Diggory. I was very bindalant and afraid to ask you for a pro-am, but I'm glad you said yes, and this was a lot of fun. POIs verbally, preferably around 5:30. Sorry, one sec, my throat is uncomfortable. Okay. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to deal with what I think is probably the strongest point from, well, not the strongest point, but a point that I think a lot of OG's case rests on, right? I think that they tell us that firstly, voters are really stupid, and then that secondly, there's likely to be poor reporting of these things, and so people are going to be stupid regardless. I think this is just the stock voters are stupid thing. This is symmetric. They are literally likely to vote for bad parties, even with normal election cycles. Like literally look at the US right now. Right? I think this is probably a moot point. But I think secondly, then, when you actually have snap elections, these are often issues that are quite pressing, right? Like think about Brexit, think about France in the status quo, right? I think there's likely to be a lot of coverage now, or if it is an issue that has been pressing, such as political instability for a significant amount of time, there's likely to be a significant amount of reporting on this, simply just because, political instability, for example, is quite apparent. It's, very easy for media sources to pick up on these kinds of things. So I think that, you're probably unlikely then to just get this rash decision making that they claim, simply because of the fact that there is likely to be, a significant amount of your voter base that is informed. I think it just, becomes really apparent when there's likely to be a snap election anyways, when you see a lot of political instability and you see the ruling party posturing for this kind of stuff. So I think that it's quite obvious, or not obvious, but it's quite fair to be able to predict when these things are going to happen and inform, like, the population regardless. But I think that even if, this is the case and the ruling party wins again or whatever, I just don't think this is particularly bad. I think that this likely reinforces their democratic legitimacy. I think this probably gives people more trust in the government when they're able to, come in again and, do whatever they're doing. So I think this is probably just also better in general for them being able to enact their policy and gain confidence overall. But another point of response then, I think actually it's really important to be able to have a snap election specifically as a tool for maneuvering when there are issues with coalitions or, parliament as is, right? I think, like, really good examples are, for example, Malaysia in 2020, when they, there was like a lot of political instability because the dominant coalition broke down, the parties were beefing with each other, no one could agree on anything, right? And so the threat of a snap election here is incredibly important, because what essentially it allows you to do is that it allows you to form a new coalition if the dominant one breaks down or can't agree on things, by replacing them and allowing for political reshuffling, right? I think that even if, maybe this doesn't solve all the political instability, like, immediately, I think it's really important because it allows for the reshuffling of, whatever the composition of parliament looks like, right? I think that this is really particularly good, specifically when there aren't mechanisms for this movement, in other ways, like OG actually explicitly tells you, right? I think the alternative to not having this political maneuvering mechanism is that you just have a dysfunctional coalition or dysfunctional parliament or a ruling party that just can't get things done, or they're struggling with internal conflict like corruption or infighting, right? I think that this is particularly bad because prolonged, times of this just makes people lose faith in the government and makes them weaker, which is important for operating. It's important for having like policy or passing legislation or whatnot. And it's just, bad because it like essentially freezes the government up. I think snap elections then uniquely just allow this kind of replacement or regrouping, right? I think the alternative is just, far worse for the economy when, there's like the key legislative or policy bodies are frozen. It's harder to actually come in and invest then when the government is too busy fighting with each other and it's unstable. It's also just kind of empirically unwise for like, people to invest in places with insane political instability just because it's volatile and higher risk, and you never know when things might go end up, right? So I think that when we're able to actually, kind of reshuffle these coalitions or parliament or whatever, body, I think this is particularly important because it allows these parties to regroup. It allows them to put forward new candidates or new coalitions that, are more likely to agree on things because the current one clearly isn't working. But I'm just going to extend then a little bit on what Diggory tells you about how, governments end up being preemptive in expecting a snap election and why this is ultimately better for, politics as a whole, right? I think if snap elections can be called and, happen within the span of a week, this literally just means that opposition parties will be forced to maintain a strong public image consistently, right? And actively criticize the incumbent government. They can't get lazy, or otherwise, if the government does call a snap election and take advantage of this, then, the opposition party gets fucked. So I think essentially it forces them to maintain some level of accountability, right? I think this is really good because the criticism will also force the incumbent government to do their job well, right? And also, it just also kind of means that voters have a better picture of what, their range of options are, or what's like actually really happening in the world of politics, or what a vote for opposition would mean when there's just a lot more political messaging happening because of this threat, right? I think their claim on like having no setup time is just kind of weird because, like, for this to be true, we have to kind of believe that the incumbent would not be subject to the same problems, right? Like, I think that if the incumbent, they're suddenly getting a bunch of people to get ready to go on the campaign trail, they're suddenly like shoring up all their like campaigning and messaging, like, what do you like think is like the opposition party, right? You're probably, going to obviously figure out that they're preparing to call a snap election. So I just think that this claim from OG doesn't really mean anything. But I think, the way in here is quite simple, right? I think that in like some cases or very important cases, there are critical reasons to actually be able to have this as like a tool for the government, right? Like, I don't know, maybe the incumbent party has, had someone really important die, or there's like a massive national crisis that people feel specifically divided on, right? I think having public legitimacy in these specific cases is crucial for a government's response to be legitimate and fair, right? I think it also just ends up being that, when they get, or if they get elected and again, it just means that people are likely to support what the government does because they feel like they had a chance to give input on what the government does and their behavior. I think this is, incredible. These cases are incredibly important within the round, and I think the margin is quite significant. Since a government's world, you probably have to wait like 3 years while the government responds to something like a pandemic without like this kind of legitimacy, as people didn't like vote for them on a platform which included their likely response to that. that. So I think that this impact is also just like, you know, likely exclusive. But I also think then that in general, just people having trust in the government is very important, right? I think that, you know, it's like kind of like the basis for which, you know, democracy works if we want to be principled. But I think that when you have unrest and a lot of discontent at, you know, some kind of crisis or policy response that just isn't adequate, right? This leads to just kind of, you know, a lot of ways for like, I don't know, bad faith actors within the government or within opposition parties to just kind of, you know, like fuck around and like, I don't know, like criticize them in bad faith, leading to like, you know, other sorts of really bad messaging. So I think that when the government has generally popular support, or even when, you know, the opposition can get behind them, or like, you know, they just have the majority within a parliament or a larger majority, I think that just gives them a wider range of options to be able to deal with whatever crisis they're currently going through. I think this is particularly relevant, specifically because of the framing in which, you know, snap elections typically are called, such as, you know, like in these crucial cases where there's a significant thing going on. Otherwise, you know, I think just, you know, them having you know, kind of like more legitimacy is good anyways. I think that, you know, like even if they do get replaced, you replace them faster, and you know, you end up with a government that's more representative and democratically legitimate at a faster speed with voter trust. So I think regardless whatever the outcome is, I just think these are very important tools and very important for you know, the state of the democracy.
Cool. Thank that speaker for their speech, and we invite the member of GOV to begin the back half.
Am I audible? Can people hear me?
Yeah, you're audible. There's a little echo though, so you might want to.
So sorry, that is just my room. I'll try and speak clearly then. We're not a pro-am team, my partner and I are both novices, but I'll take the opportunity to say that she's awesome as well. Just amazing. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2. Regardless of policy, incentives, or bureaucracy, the most important thing that you need in a state, on scale, on representing the vulnerable, and cohesion as a society as a whole, is that you need them to engage. You need your population to engage in the first place. This is prior to everything that exists within a state. This is the most important thing within this debate. Now, opening governments mentions something about voting turnout lowering. They say that you see a majority party constantly in power and then you disengage. But I'd like to note that this is just not always the case. We literally just had a snap election that occurred and the majority lost, right? This isn't something that's coherent or consistent throughout like any snap elections. But we do believe that this is an impact that can be reached, right? So 5 mechanisms as to why we just cease to care about the specifically voting process. Right? First and foremost, the idea of the emotional load, right? You're dragging up issues. It is taking up TV bandwidth, right? You feel like you must feel knowledgeable about this, right? I think this just takes up a great degree of like your brain's capacity, not just because people are dumb, but because people, to the extent to which they want to engage, they're going to try to. It is all over the TV. When I'm sitting here in like my flat, I get 3 different like flyers every single day as to who I should vote for, right? This is something that's quite emotionally taxing, right? Secondarily, it's just the frequency of it, right? If I'm an individual voter, I need to take time off work, right? I need to ensure that I am registered. I need to ensure that I have learned enough, right? Thirdly, there is just a great degree of negative campaigning, right? There are incentives for like one party to criticize the others because that is how they win, right? It is one party among many, and therefore if they're able to criticize all those many and then comparatively only show the small things that they're able to do, you just get more negative messaging on whole, right? I think, yeah, the incentives to criticize us, yes. Fourthly, there is just a perception of inefficacy, right? The idea that why did this need to happen? Why does this matter? I'll do it again in 2 years when this next government fucks up, right? The idea that this needed to happen because the government is not able to function tells me that my government is not functioning. And just finally, the idea of the lack of novelty. All of these things that an election requires you to engage in, all of these things that election requires you to do means that it is something that is quite emotionally, something that's quite physically and financially taxing, right? As a result of this, right, you do just cease to care the more frequently that they occur. As in, if they happen every 1.5 years, which please note, this is not something that's ridiculous. Did we not like all exist in the UK for like a good length of time? But yes, because of this, at the extent which this occurs, you just cease to care, or at the very least you begin to disengage. You don't watch the debates. You don't read the flyers that come through your door, right? Why is this then bad? Another 5 reasons. First and foremost, you just get a lack of representation. When people disengage, right, the government then, that is then elected, just has less knowledge about the ones of the people, right? I think this goes against the entire principle of democracy. And in that, when you have less knowledge of the people that you want to govern, then you cannot then as efficaciously govern those people. If I do not know what my people want, even if I have the best incentives in government, then I'm unable to serve them as their leader, right? But I think as far as opening opposition talks about a lack of legitimacy, a majority government voted in only by a smaller percentage or just less capable of achieving that level of legitimacy as a leader, because fundamentally they have less people backing them, less people behind them, right? You don't achieve legitimacy until people engage, right? But I think thirdly, a lot of what opening a government talks about, right, the as far as like populist policies, right, a lot of those remaining votes, given that I've already proven that a lot of people will cease to care, that will disengage, because that's just their natural reaction to feeling overwhelmed, feeling burnt out, and feeling overburdened, right? At the point of which people disengage, right, the remaining votes will vote quickly. You will, like, as far as you will vote at all, you will vote in whatever you are told to vote in first instance. You will not look at the deeper issues. This is how we unlock the populist policies point that opening government wants to talk about, right? But fourthly, you also get like a lack of accountability for the wrongdoings, right? When you have less engaged voters, when you have voters that feel like engaging in politics is something that is emotionally taxing to them rather than a civic duty that they can partake in, it is no longer an ability for them to be able to like exercise their right, because they do not feel that any government they vote in will be in long enough for them to actually achieve anything, right? When you do not have that level of engagement, right, you have a lack of accountability in general, right? You have less engaged voters, you have less examining of individuals who are at the top. I'll take a PY from opening.
Yeah, the snap election usually happens instead of the normal like election date. So I think a lot of your material isn't important because the like election's equivalently expensive. It's just happening a little earlier instead of later, and people feel similarly engaged because they only still have that one election.
Thank you. Great. I take your point. I understand. However, this is just not always the case. The ability to, okay, even if it is replacing a traditional election, the capacity for them to do it more often than a regular election still incurs all of the things that I'm talking about. As I am like growing up as a student in the United Kingdom, when there are 4 elections in the last 5 years, right? Even if they are in theory replacing the current elections, the fact that it is capable for them to exist more often than the regular ones means that it is taking up more of my bandwidth, right? Even if in theory they are replacing them, we know that they are not, because they have the capacity to occur more frequently. This is how I unlock my benefits. It is not purely based on some kind of replacement strategy, right? So I think finally, as far as like the harms of this voter fatigue, you end up with just a general lack of social cohesion, right? A move to polarization, right? When you have a general lack of faith in the efficiency and the capabilities of your government, because they are constantly having to call these snap elections. Note that these do occur more frequently. You feel that you're being burdened upon by your government more frequently to vote in an election. You do not feel that any government you vote in will be efficacious enough, right? Therefore, I'm more likely to fall to things like anti-government rhetoric. I'm more likely to fall into like a core tenet of more extremist, more polarized groups, right? But what is the comparative? Why do we care more about regular elections? I think when you have a set schedule, when you have time to anticipate, it is an event of significance. It is something that is novel, right? When people have adequate campaigning time, I care more about the things that they are saying, right? I think of it more as a routine civil duty rather than another job that I have to complete that I will likely have to do in another couple of years. It additionally doesn't feel manipulative, right? I don't feel that it is the government that is calling it on like an issue-based level. It doesn't feel like a ploy. It feels like something that I ought to do. So looking at overall case impacts before I'm finished, right? I think the broad results of my case, with it being logically prior to a lot of things that opening government wants to state, i.e. if I want good policy, if I want engagement, if I want representation, then I have to engage in the first place. When this ceases to allow people to engage or ceases to encourage people to engage, you do not get this. I think at this point, you have a level of representation without the knowledge of how to best represent citizens. You don't have the upholding of rights via accountability mechanisms, and you no longer have that intrinsic value of treating people within a state as an autonomous individual, right? You are no longer representative because you can no longer represent those people because they no longer care about your ability to represent them. As I've stated, regardless of policy, incentives, or bureaucracy, the most important thing on net is that you can engage as a whole. This is the most important thing within this debate. Thank you.
Dope. We thank that speaker for their speech. We'd like to invite a member of OP.
Hello. PYs, please, in the chat. Everyone's doing some thank yous, so I guess I'll thank Aiden Wu for letting me debate in his bathroom this entire weekend. It's been truly a transformative experience. In 2016, Malcolm Turnbull, the leader of Australia, called a snap election. And the reason he did it was there was an incredible set of industrial policies that he needed to get passed. There were regulations around workers' rights, but the opposition party just wouldn't let them pass. He didn't have control of the Senate, and there was never any accountability on that opposition party for constantly being so obstructionist. So he called a snap election, he won the Senate, and he got the policy passed. The point is that overwhelmingly these elections are called because of the fact that you need to get in control of power and you need to be able to control the party. You need to be able to control a parliament that may not exactly like you. The first thing I want to do is just explain why is it that snap elections actually happen incredibly rarely. The impact of this is, firstly, it obviously beats out CG, who is like, snap elections happen all the time. If they happen very rarely, then they cannot get any of their benefits. It obviously beats out OG, because OG's entire thing is like, well, snap elections are really, really bad every time they happen. If we can minimize the instances in which those elections happen, then the harms they have about these being slightly worse elections then obviously cannot manifest. But also additionally, all the sort of narrative things based around it, like for example, people's opinions are now changed and the view with respect to democracy in general is less important if we can just explain there are less elections existing. But obviously then it is able to beat out opening opposition. As I'll explain in the next point, why is it, what situations are they called and why we maximize the benefits in those, which means that even if we only get a couple of those situations, our case is still able to exist independent of that. So I don't think opening opposition can really exist in the context that we point out, as these snap elections not really happening a whole often. There are a couple of reasons why they don't happen very often. The first is they're incredibly risky, right? That is, you just don't know if you're going to win or lose an election, especially like, and why would you implement a snap election? Macron most recently lost his snap election. Any given election oftentimes comes down to incredibly small margins. Oftentimes opinion polls before the elections are incredibly inaccurate because of the fact that it doesn't capture the entire population who is set out to vote. You don't know what's actually going to happen because there's a lot of uncertainty between when the election actually happens and what you have, which means that there's literally no reason that you as a party will want to implement this thing. And especially the thing I want to point out is like, why would you risk a snap election where you can just empirically have like 2 more extra years of being in government, 100% implement whatever the hell you want? Why would you take that risk in the first place by calling a snap election maybe to maximize the number that you have into the future? It's really unclear as to why you take this risk. Because the other thing I want to point out is if presumably you're polling well at this point in time, the incentive for you, like you would think that you poll well into the future, which means that you probably can just afford to like take the 2 years, win the next normal election, and then continue ruling on beforehand. And instead you just get to do all the good policy that you've been coasting on for the past period of time. So it's incredibly unclear to me why in average situations you would take the risk of possibly losing, even if it was true that you were like so certain that you're going to win the snap election, why you would actually engage in that. The second thing I want to just point out is like empirically these things don't happen often, and just ask yourself, panel, how many snap elections can you name versus how many actual elections? POIs in the chat, please. Like, I'm sorry, OG, you can't just name a country and then a number and then expect that to count as evidence for it. Like, what are you doing? The third thing, though, is that presumably that if you believe this, they're just shortening the terms, right? Like, if I call a snap election 1 year earlier, now instead I just have 3-year terms instead of 4-year terms, which is just one-dimensionally bad. So it's unclear why you'd constantly do the rotating cycle of snap elections that this scheme wants to suggest. But the last thing is just like, the reasons that CG gives as to why is it that you're actually going to piss people off, right? Like, I think people get annoyed when they constantly have to be called out to the ballots. And when specifically the opposition party is able to say, it is these wankers who are putting you in charge, you obviously are able to target that and explain that. The last thing I just want to point out about the shorter term point, that's like, you just want longer periods of time in which for you to do your policy, because a 4-year policy is probably going to be better than a 3-year policy, which means that you get it off. This obviously beats out both government teams insanely cleanly. Let's then talk about then the instances in which you actually call it. There are 2 instances you call these elections. The first is that you exist currently a deadlock in parliament and you're unable to resolve this in any other way. And the key distinctions I want to make here with opening opposition, because they do say like the same words that I'm going to say, but they do not explain it to nearly the detail that we're going to explain here. And that is that when you actually, before that, I'll take opening.
Yeah, when a snap election is called, it exaggerates the circumstances for the election, so people are more susceptible to things like sensationalization.
Yeah, sure. Like, I did hear your case, gang. The point is, though, like, as we will explain later, even if that sensationalism exists, like, Okay, so I guess the framing of the previous point is the only reason that you call a snap election is one, you are incredibly certain you're going to win, in which case the sensationalization point is irrelevant because the party that's going to win is then always going to win. So it's unclear why it's bad if the party wins on sensationalism. But the second thing is that we will explain why is it that this gives them a uniquely important political tool that lets them pass policy in a way that would not be able to on the opposition side. Because the other note I have on OG is that obviously, the incumbent party has a range of advantages over the other party, right? That they are able to implement policy compared to the opposition party. They have control of things like the media. It's unclear why this advantage is the tipping point and why we should ban it. So when do you implement this thing? The first is in your deadlock, and that's oftentimes you don't hold things like the Senate. That means we just fix the problem because if you implement it in the circumstances where you're overwhelmingly popular, and importantly, these are the circumstances where obviously then the people agree that this is the best option to go through with, then you just reclaim control of the Senate and can implement policy that like the population far better likes. But the second thing I want to point out is oftentimes it's very easy for opposition parties to be obstructionists. That is, they're able to say that things like votes or public opinion pieces don't reflect what actually the public thinks, and they're able to be obstructionists without having like effective backlash from the general population. The things like referendums are often not legally binding and have far less turnout. The comparative is when you hold a vote on a specific issue, that is a legally binding mandate that tells the opposition party right to their face that shut up, we need to get this policy passed. And that's far stronger and means that you have less obstructionism. But the second thing is that you just likely less have crisis during crisis. I will only say that the reason you call it during crisis is the parties care about the people and want to get their opinion. Here's why it's in the incentive of the party in power to call it during a crisis. One, it ensures you have control into the future, which means that, for example, when you're dealing with a long-term crisis like Abe was in 2017 during the North Korea incident, it means you're far more able to ensure that you can control your party and implement long-term policies that get you out of the crisis. But secondly, you don't need to worry about having an election. Elections are incredibly difficult to deal with, and if you're worrying about dealing with an election, you can't pass COVID stimulus policy. That means it means that these people are far more likely to call them at the start of the crisis, so they're able to navigate the crisis better. Why is this a set of most important? Firstly, because obviously this explains during the worst instances, which is most likely when these things are going to be called, we are actually able to recover. You can get the economic recovery during COVID. You are able to deal with the tumultuous political landscape and then lead your country out to betterness. It is far more important that we prioritize these. But secondly, obviously we just explained this is an instance in which everyone in the country wants this thing passed. So it isn't an instance where the voters are unfairly represented. They are accurately represented. All of these reasons oppose.
Awesome. We thank that speaker for their speech. We'd like to invite the Gav Whip to present their speech.
Hi, just checking that I'm clear and audible before I begin.
Yep.
Perfect. I've got the chat open, so if all POIs could go in there rather than verbally, that would be great. Okay, and then I'll start my speech in a minute. If a democracy isn't representative and doesn't represent the will of the people within that country, what's the point of having a democracy? This is the key thing that comes out of closing government. We prove to you why snap elections are decrease voter turnout, decrease voter engagement, and therefore make democracies less representative and less able to actually represent the people that live within them. First, weighing over OG, then going into OO, and finally CG. So what do we get out of OG? We get it worsens discourse, and we get that it is able to strengthen the majority. I'll come into the strengthens majority point later because I think that becomes a huge class with OO, and so I'll deal with it more then. But in terms of worsens discourse, we agree that this is true. When they say low turnout, they don't really explain how this actually happens, and that's what you get from the CG case. Rather than asserting that people become disengaged, we actually prove the mechanisms by which people become disengaged. But secondly, I think when we're talking about sensationalism and asymmetric ability to prepare, I think all of that's true. I just think that the impact of this, i.e. that you get worse policy because people are less involved, you also access that obviously on the CG case because you get worse policy under the mechanisms that Zoe gave you simply because your democracy is less representative, and so the policy that is passed, even if you can pass it very effectively, is not representative of what people within the country actually want. And then B, the second impact that they go into is sort of harms to the economy, harms to stability of investment. I just think this is less important than the actual burden of like making democracies represent the people that live within them, right? Like, I think this is like dependent on what actually happens within the snap election, because the truth is that the snap election might be very clear who's going to win it, and there might be no change in power, and therefore the stability and the changes in investment are likely to be very minimal. But B, I just think even at the worst case where this does harm the economy a lot, I just don't think it's as important as the fact that on CG we prove to you that democracy itself is threatened by the fact that voter turnout is so affected, and is threatened by the fact that they become less represented. Okay, moving on to opening opposition. Opening opposition give us 4 main pushes, all of which I think are less important or less like way under what we get from ours. So firstly, they say that like it allows you to maintain a stronghold, and this is good because you like if people vote for you, that like represents their will, but it doesn't represent what they want you to do actually when you are in government, because they state things like, oh, if it's like a particularly nationalist moment, I can capitalize on that. If England win at the football and then there is a snap election called because people are feeling very nationalistic and proud that England won at the football, that doesn't mean that the nationalistic party is actually going to enact policy that benefits any of those people. This doesn't actually improve representation. I think what we're talking about in closing government is not just, oh, I voted for you so that you represent me, but actually I'm able to actually understand what your policy is and vote for you because I'm interested and because I'm engaged in what is actually happening. We prove that the engagement goes, and so the representation also follows. Changing circumstances. This is the second thing that OO say. They say that, oh, it's important under like big national changes like Brexit or whatever, that you can change the government to reflect this. I think what this does is it incentivizes parties to not prepare for things like that. Like, i.e., if you can just call a snap election anytime something changes, I think what happens is you don't prepare for what will your party do if there is a pandemic? How will you deal with that? What will you do if there is a big financial crash? How will you deal with that? I think that because you know you can call a snap election and like campaign on these issues totally separately, it removes them from the actual discourse in terms of what is going to happen in regular elections. I think what this means is that you end up with less communication of how parties will deal with crises, and I think that this is a key issue that should be involved in regular election platforms anyway, because I want to know how the members of government that are going to represent me are going to deal with crises when they emerge. I think this is an important part of governance that will be removed, is more likely to not happen under the framing under the analysis that we get from opening opposition. Okay, the other thing is like strong opposition and breaking deadlock. These are the main pushes that we also get from CO, so I'm going to come on to this later. But on the strong opposition, I think that the idea that the threat of snap elections is what makes opposition pay more attention, I don't necessarily think this is true under the framing that opening opposition give themselves. Opening opposition say that people get into politics because they care and because they want to like engage and help people. I think that if you are an opposition member of government, you are going to be engaged no matter what, because you did still get elected, like you are still in government. And so you still obviously have policy agendas that you want to fulfill because you got into politics, according to OO, because you care about people and because you care about the platform that you're promoting. So I don't necessarily think that the threat of snap elections is as integral to the push for strong opposition as they say they do. Okay, what do we get from CO? Firstly, we get this characterization that they don't happen very often. I think this is false. They say that you can't they say that it's like risky. This counters all the OO framing because OO say you'll do it when you're strong. They say it's empirically false and that it doesn't happen. In the last 10 years, we've had four elections in the United Kingdom. We had the 2015, 2017, 2019, and we had one like 5 days ago. So I don't think that they can just say that it's unlikely to happen. Shorter, they also say that it decreases your term length. I don't necessarily think that's true either. I think a lot of the time what happens is you call a snap election and then you reset your term length to be from that election. So I don't necessarily think that this impact actually happens. Before I go on, I'll take the opening POI.
Yeah, I think no party could ever possibly preemptively predict every single possible thing that it might be really important to put in their platform. And most voters don't vote off of the basis of those possible preemptive things. They vote like based off economic policy or because they think the leader's handsome. So I think there are a lot of important instances where you call these selections.
I don't necessarily think that, I just think that because most people don't care about it, that doesn't mean it should be included. I think a lot of people do care about things like that. And so it's something that you should think about, even if it is just for like a smaller group of voters than perhaps our best case. Even on worst case, I think there are voters that do care about those issues. But secondly, I just think that it promotes short-termist thinking, as I said, right? Like it means that you don't plan for all eventualities. It makes them feel safer. It makes you feel like you don't have to prepare for the worst. And so I think that's just a bad mentality for politics to take on. Okay, so countering the CEO framing that it happens rarely. They say it's risky. That goes against what the leader of opposition says. He says that you'll call them when you're strong because you have the mandate to do it. Shorter terms, that's not true. Empirically false. 4 elections, 10 years. So not empirically false. Okay, so then deadlock. This also comes up from opening, interestingly. I don't think that this is the only way to do that. I think A, you can change leader, you can make internal changes in government. B, I think that like deadlock and compromise, a deadlock forces compromise sometimes, and I think that can be beneficial because C, and this is the main thing, representation, which as we've already outlined is the most important clash in this debate because it allows democracy to work. If there is an obstructionist opposition party, they will also voted in, and their opinion also matters. Like CO rely on this case being that the good policy is being obstructed, and it could also happen the other way. Opposition could also be preventing a very harmful policy, and so I don't think that this impact weighs up to anything that you hear from CG or from further up in the debate.
Speaker for their speech would like to invite the opposite speech first. Okay.
Cool. I assume I'm audible. On closing opposition, we uniquely explain to you why comparatively we are going to get better democracy on our side. Firstly, just to make very clear where our extension is distinct from OO and where it is why it is more important than the contribution OO brings into this debate. So I think the first thing, right, is that we explain that the context in which you have a snap election, right, is when there's going to be support for the majority, right? And so, for example, OO just say that we have some instances. We actually give you unique mechanisms, right? Why these are the only instances, the ones with crises, where you desperately need to break deadlock, right? Because of the overwhelming risk of elections. Note that CO, right, CG kind of do the, you're knifing them. We never knife them, right, with the framing. Obviously, politicians want to win, which is what OO said. We're just saying politicians want to be certain that they will win, right? So that they are going to think very hard because they know that they could lose and won't want to risk it. It's totally compatible with what OO says. It just adds additional nuance to the case. Note that our stuff, right, about the circumstances in which you call elections, right, responds also to the government bench because OO kind of say, snap, because OO's best response, right, to OG's kind of case that you'll have elections all the time. It's just that it's empirical. And I think the second thing, right, is that we're going to minimize the harms, right, of why the elections are not representative. In that elections, because elections only happen, right? The elections aren't going to happen when one party has overwhelming control. They're likely to happen when there's a crisis, when there's deadlock, when there's this kind of stuff. And I also then just want to explain why our stuff on crisis is better, right? So the first thing was just to explain we show why politicians will actually call elections, right? Note that this also takes a much stronger burden than OO, which relies on politicians being altruistic. Unfortunately, even if politicians are altruistic, they will often be outcompeted by politicians who are not altruistic, right? Because those selfish politicians won't resign, for example, if they feel that it's morally correct, this kind of stuff. So this just applies to many more cases and is therefore more convincing. I think that later, I think then, right, the thing is to note is why you call it, right? So we'll explain why you draw in crises, because this is beneficial for the party in power, but we also explain why these instances are where it's most important to have control. And note that we also just explain why crises will get better. In the OO kind of say, it's important in crises, but we specifically say how you can get out of a crisis. Note that the impact, the case really only stands, right, at the point at which you have this logic. It doesn't work with the kind of assertion. Yeah, then just two ways in which we win the debate. So firstly, I just want to point out deadlock is extremely bad and how it actually brings the benefits that CG claim they have, right? Which is just first to say, right, when you have deadlock, you literally cannot pass policy. What does this mean? Firstly, there are just a whole host of serious harms, especially in situations when you're in crisis, because, for example, you literally can't approve your country's budget. This means people in government can't get paid, right? Governments employ huge numbers of people. But two, I think in terms of people getting disenfranchised, at the point at which you see your government just arguing all the time and not able to do anything, you view it as weak, right? And this is when you're more likely to think, shit, democracy doesn't work, we should go for authoritarianism, than if your elections are at best slightly more frequent. right? And then I think the second thing is that, yeah, again, to remind, right, on the impacts, right, war extension outright wins, it's just that we actually fix the crises, which otherwise, which otherwise doesn't happen on this. Then, sorry, just a few responses to GovBench, right? So I think GovBench basically, like OG gives us like a big laundry list of why democracy doesn't work. I think the first and most obvious problem in OG's case, right, is it is not comparative, which is to say, they say our voters are uninformed, the majority party is better able to organize. None of this ever explains like why it will be worse in snap elections. I think that the second thing is also, so OG like make their case extremely contingent on this being in developing countries because apparently voters are less educated there. Like, I think this is slightly offensive. Like, many developing countries do have good standards of education, but also I think there's a widespread assumption on GovBench that voters are really stupid and easily manipulated. But like, most voters do have access to newspaper, right? Like, they kind of know what their interests are. They're able to think which politicians will do things that are in my interests and vote for them. Like, I think that you have to do a lot of work, right, to explain why people won't rationally do things in their self-interest and would instead like do something that is obviously contrary to that. I don't think you can just kind of assert this. Then like we have the stuff from government, right, on just asymmetric preparation times. Like, guys, I think the first thing is that obviously like the bigger parties with more power will win better. But I think the other problem that you have to explain is why are these shorter times, like presumably bigger parties, right, which like stand in more seats across the country, actually need more time to prepare, and to mobilize a massive party means that you probably like aren't going to set the election at a super small window, right? Note that there are also just legal restrictions on how like short the windows can be. Again, also, right, of course, all of opening government stuff is contingent upon the elections to be quite frequent. Dhruv uniquely proves to you why they won't be frequent, right? Which I think means that two of opening opposition's cases, right? The first thing about why it's good for the incumbents to win more, and the stuff about opposition parties, right? Not less resting on the laurels, just become less important. Obviously, they still, like, I'm not saying they don't stand. I'm just saying they're much less important compared to the unique benefits that we bring you. Yeah, then, sure.
The real reason for why politicians often have snap elections is because they believe if they do not do so, they're going to get killed on the inside through internal party coups. So if Rishi Sunak cannot turn the polls around, he'll get killed on the inside. So you take the tactical risk of rolling the dice on an election as opposed to dying from the inside up.
Okay, like one, you should have put this like in your case, but also like I don't think I think Rishi Sunak just wanted to go off to California. I think this is like just looking at CG, right? Like this is one of the problems, obviously, in CG's case, is that CG, like firstly, their empirical evidence is the UK had a bunch of elections. One, note that the UK has a regular election cycle anyway, but I think that also CG stuff about you just get burnt out, like guys, you're having like maybe an election once every 2 years and it takes you 30 minutes to go to a polling booth and, you know, maybe another 30 minutes to read like the little leaflet that they give you about the candidates. I don't know if they give you this in the UK. I think they give it to you in America, right? Like, I just don't see why this will make it worse. But I think that when you have like more frequent elections, even in their very best case, it's unclear why this makes voters less engaged, which is to say that now you like regularly go to the polling booth, you kind of know where it is, you make it a habit, right? Like you like probably there are more ads to get people registered, just very unclear. But note that we also did just prove to, like that's in the worst case. We also did prove to you like why this is just extremely unlikely to happen. Note that a bunch of their stuff about like are the people like, you know, the greater degree of negative messaging, firstly is derivative, but secondly, like if negative messaging is so good at winning elections, parties will do it anyway, right? Because they want to win, so they're likely to do populism in either case. So I think that this also means that this benefit kind of falls out of the round, which I think is like problematic for them. Yeah, so then, right? So I think the key things that we bring you are like explaining why we actually get out of economic crises better, why deadlock is specifically bad, and we take out a lot of opening government bench, and we specifically explain why our mechanisms are better than OO. Incredibly proud to propose.
Awesome. Thank you guys for what was a wonderful round.